It's a conference like no other. No minutes are taken, no report is written, and no one on the outside is entirely sure what the point of it all is. We're talking about the annual meeting of the Bilderberg Group, which takes place in the Austrian Alps this weekend. George Osborne, Henry Kissinger, Ryanair chief Michael O'Leary, the Google boss Eric Schmidt are amongst the contingent of global politicians and business leaders meeting behind those closed doors. Well, Tony Gosling is an investigative journalist and an expert on the Bilderberg Group. Good morning, Tony.
Morning.
You've been researching this for some time now, haven't you?
Yeah, well, you just said no one's sure. Well, I think you're probably right, actually, but I've got a bit of an idea because I've spent a while investigating these guys.
Good. You've got more of an idea than most of us.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about it. Let's go right to the beginning and just remind us how this group began in the first place.
Well, first conference was in 1954, all the way back in what was then the Cold War. And I think really what we're seeing here is a kind of relic. These people are kind of Cold War dinosaurs, but certainly the little Dutch town of Oosterbeek was where it first started, in a little hotel. And 10 years previous to that, one of the things I've discovered is that there was a battle going on there. People have ever seen the film A Bridge Too Far. It was where the British 1st Airborne Division were isolated in exactly the same spot, which was called the Witches' Cauldron back at the time, or the Hexenkessel by the Nazis, was where the British were surrounded and massacred in Arnhem. The same spot is where the first conference took place. I mean, what was happening really, though, in the 50s was the CIA were frightened that Europe was going communist, and some parts of it was. You know, Italy, for example, a lot of people were voting communist. And the main, I think, thrust of it all was to make sure that Europe stayed very much welded to the US. A lot of it was CIA money, the newly founded CIA, that got the first conference going. And I think, in a way, that sort of reflects now, because these are the sorts of people that really don't want Russia to have the 2018 World Cup. And I think that there's actually an aspect to the whole FIFA scandal that you can almost point the fingers at the Bilderbergs and the types of people that started it and saying, hang on a minute, you really don't want all these Europeans travelling to Russia and Moscow. So they're trying to really drive a wedge, and they've been doing it for literally decades between us in Western Europe and Russia and the powers to the east.
So who takes part? How do you get an invitation to this?
Well, there's a little steering committee. It's really from the NATO countries. A couple of people from each of the main NATO countries are on that steering committee, and they will decide who's going to come. What they tend to do is really just invite their corporate mates. I mean, we're talking about the major constituent of it is bankers, people involved in banking, but then there's also media barons, mostly private media barons. But I noticed actually your BBC chair, Rona Fairhead's there as well this week. And then you've got royalty, arms companies, politicians. I think, it's in Austria, which is, I think, really significant because there's a deal the Austrians are trying to do. I mean, they're very proud of their neutrality. They're not in NATO, which is strange because most of these conferences are in NATO countries, and they're trying to negotiate something called the South Stream pipeline for gas to come into Austria. So that bypasses Ukraine, so that the Europeans don't have to say to the Ukrainians, please switch on the Russian gas and switch it off for us. It's really important. And, of course, there's lots of energy companies there too. The gas companies, the oil companies, they're all in there. And I think, a lot of people would point to, particularly in the Middle East, the energy companies as being actually the impetus behind some of the wars that we've had there, to take over the resources.
But there's lots of conspiracy theories, aren't there, about this group? And they must face criticism for this lack of, accountability, transparency. It doesn't seem to stop them, though.
No, it doesn't, and they start to look every year more and more like a kind of Bond villains convention. I mean, I think that there is absolutely. I mean, if you've been reading anything that the Guardian have been publishing, they've got an excellent thing called the Builder blog by Charlie Skelton there. You'll find that there's literally thousands of journalists covering the G7 the weekend, and this is only 20 miles away from that, just across the Alps into Austria. But the journalists are being absolutely hounded. I mean, literally, Charlie had police coming into his hotel room at 1 o'clock in the morning. The contrast is pretty chilling, actually, that there's thousands of journalists covering the G7 doing exactly what the press people who run that want, and yet hardly any and no press access whatsoever to Bilderberg.
Thanks, Tony. Tony Gosling's an investigative journalist and an expert on the Bilderberg Group. We'll probably never find out what happens.